All right.
Good morning. I hope everyone's doing well. Today we have the pleasure of having Cam McCarroll and Wasim Karaguli, and they're going to talk about everything related to Bitcoin today. And we've done a few of these Bitcoin ones in the past. I think this is our third session about Bitcoin. We're going to talk specifically about Bitcoin, the future of Bitcoin, why it may be a good idea to have it in your portfolio. And I'll turn it over to Wasim and Cam. You guys take it away from here.
All right. Well, Wasim, where do we start, buddy?
Um,
We've got some
Probably.
highlights to talk about, like maybe what is on the, it's been where do we go first? Where do you go
I
first in
think,
Bitcoin land?
I think recently, I mean, of course, we can always talk price and prices, it is
Yeah.
now and now, $100,000 US Bitcoin seems to be a non-event anymore. It's,
Mm.
it's been up at 100,000. It's hit an all-time high recently. It was, what did it hit? 112,000. So I
Hmm.
think, it's going to stay around these parts. If it dips back into 5 digits, so I'm trying to say is get used to 6 digit Bitcoin because I think this is here to stay. And I
Yeah.
think we're well on the way to 7 digit Bitcoin. I know we're only 10% the way there, and it feels like it's a long way away to get to a million, but it'll be there soon. I don't know how soon, but it'll be there. And it's worth highlighting that because if you see, yeah, I mean, it was a pretty, and this is where the Matt's decoupling question comes. He talked about MicroStrategy, but you can also talk about decoupling from the markets because I mean, much like the S&P that dipped recently as well in April, it trended in that same direction with the rest of the market, but it rebounded faster than the rest of the market, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it didn't go as far down as the rest of the market either. It usually tracks a lot deeper in correction. And didn't I don't know what percentage it was off the correlation, but it definitely didn't follow the same, when Bitcoin dives much farther and faster than
Right.
assets generally, and it just didn't do that. It performed more like a risk off asset during that correction than it did almost other assets, and then rebounded just as well and over and took a new all-time high. And it's been, like you said, consolidating in this sort of range between, it did dip down to 97 or so, or 98
Yep.
for a little bit
Yep.
there, but
Yep.
it's just been hanging out. Um,
And what's interesting, whenever it dips down back into 5 digit territories like the high 90s, the buying pressure is enormous. So you see that in the ETF flows because it's really interesting because the ETF flows report every day. So you can see at close of business, what the ETF flows look like. Is there more money coming into the ETF flows or more money coming out of the ETF flows? Which means if you can map that directly to Bitcoin buying or Bitcoin selling so during the week. And of course, you can see the volume on Bitcoin as well over the weekends. So Bitcoin generally tends to move. And now we're seeing some macroeconomic headwinds. We're seeing some, yesterday some interesting military headwinds, right, over in the Middle East. So the oil
mm,
prices spiked yesterday. Gold was up yesterday. So they always say in Bitcoin land, Bitcoin loves a good crisis. So,
mhm.
it's we'll see what happens this weekend. It's based here. You see it dip down. It hit, I think, 103,000 overnight, but it's based here, and let's see where it goes from here. But there's every expectation, like the next run up, is it. If you look at kind of the options plays and the futures on Bitcoin, there's really two major bands of support right now. So one we're at right now, and you can always see it. We're hitting that double top to the left. And I think you've marked it out on your chart.
Yeah.
There's another one further down around the low 90s, like 93-ish level. Further down, yeah, further down, yeah, right there, right. You can see another big band of support, and
Right
it's
here,
built
right?
a strong base there. And then the latest one that's kind of been talked about is further down around the 75, 74 level,
Yeah.
which is kind of the next. This is kind of, let's call this the rock
The
bottom
lower
price,
support level.
the lowest support level right now. So there's the buying pressure as it dips below into these levels is going to be, as we've seen now, like it only gets into the 95s, 96, and you see massive buying pressure. So imagine it dips down back to the 75, 76 level. Um, I know a few people that probably sell some chairs in the house to buy some Bitcoin at those levels.
Yeah. So where are you seeing the buying pressure, and how are you monitoring that, Wasim? You're talking about ETF flows. Is there something specific that you look at to monitor this? Like how do you get a sense of that? Like, is there a resource that you use, or?
You know, as some Bitcoin observers have said, you know, Bitcoin for the longest time was a retail game. You know, up until 2018, maybe even 2019, it was mostly a retail game, and it was mostly retail players. Which, you know, and the long short of it is which, by the way, constitute the majority of the holder base. So if you look at kind of, you know, who owns Bitcoin, and you'll see that since inception, 2009-ish till effectively now, still about, you know, upwards of 50% of the actual long-term holder base, basically people that have bought Bitcoin and have held it for years, right? At least 155 days. That's the technical definition of long-term holder supply. So it's, you know, you're talking about almost 60% of the holder base is retail. But that game has changed. Now you're seeing institutional players come in. You know,
Mhm.
the Bitcoin conference just recently happened, and you know we'll delve into that in a little bit. There's massive institutions. You hear a lot about Bitcoin treasuries. Companies are now buying.
Yeah.
Your institutional, obviously, the BlackRocks and the Fidelities, and you know, the BlackRock IBIT ETF is the best performing ETF on the planet in the history of the ETFs. Like
Right.
it's a $70 billion behemoth, right? And it got there. Think about this. January 10th, 2024. Like we are literally, you know, 18 months into this, and it's the fastest growing ETF in history.
Yeah, it's insane.
Gold, right, which people generally kind of, you know, correlate to kind of store of value and protection, you know, against monetary debasement, etc. I mean, it took it 10 years to get to these levels. The Bitcoin ETF did it in one.
Right.
So so that's institutional demand, right? And that's just
Yeah.
BlackRock. I'm not even talking about Fidelity and ARK and Galaxy and Purpose, and like all these other funds, right? Then you've got the corporates, you know, the treasuries that are buying, so the MicroStrategy and the GameStops and the Semler Scientifics and the Meta Planets, etc. That's buying. I mean, Michael Saylor just this past week bought, you know, more Bitcoin than what was produced the you know, this entire month. So at some point you're going to say, okay, oh, and I should probably add, so that's, you know, you've got retail, you've got institutional, you've got corporate. The banks now with SAB 21, there's some regulation
Mhm.
coming in that's going to allow banks to get a cut piece of the pie as well and start custodying Bitcoin and offering that a way for
Mhm.
you to save in Bitcoin, and you can open a Bitcoin savings account. So that's
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
And then we haven't even talked about sovereign
So,
wealth.
could you elaborate on, Wasim? So, down the future, you're saying if you go into a bank, you'll literally be able to save in Bitcoin as opposed to save in dollars. Is that correct?
They want a piece of the action. They know that, you know, Bitcoin is performing. There are people that are holding it. So they want you to be able, and they recognize it's a highly liquid collateralized asset. You know, just like you have a home. I mean, banks are perfectly happy giving a HELOC against your home. Why? Because it's a safe asset that appreciates over time, and
Right.
it can be liquidated, right, for them to protect their investment. Well, Bitcoin essentially has the same properties. It's just digital. That's the really only difference. Now, for those speculators out there that don't see long-term Bitcoin play and they don't see Bitcoin being a thing moving forward, and they see this as a big Ponzi and is going to crash to zero, well, you know, then you've got to do unfortunately, you need to do your homework, right? Like if you don't spend your 100 hours of doing the research to get some conviction on Bitcoin, and you know, and you don't get off zero, and you don't do your homework, and you never kind of get to a point where you feel some level of conviction on Bitcoin, then, you know, unfortunately, the asset class may come and go, and you may not participate, or you will participate, but when the price is significantly higher than where we are right now. So
Yeah.
but banks are looking at that and saying, okay, well, for those people that are holding Bitcoin, I mean, maybe we can start lending them money against their Bitcoin holdings because it's highly liquid, and there are technology mechanisms today where we can basically hold that collateral in some sort of trust.
Hmm.
And you know, if you and we'll give you a 1 year loan, and of course the interest rates are not great right now, but
Hmm.
if you want to borrow, you know, 50% uh, loan to value on your Bitcoin, there are companies out there that will do it today.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the SAB, it's SAB, I think
SAB 20, yeah, 121, yeah.
121. That was it was like a bank regulatory process that was in place that kind of made it really hard for banks to access the cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. And that this is like it's new guidance I think essentially it's not a regulatory framework in itself. It's
No,
just a guidance, almost a note, if you will, or like
it
a
is.
memo to all financial institutions to here's our basic guidance around cryptocurrencies. You can now explore it, and there's some leeway to them using cryptocurrencies in their on their balance sheets and so on and so forth. It's not like a like the banks were not really, they're so cautious, right? And so risk averse. Whenever there was any guidance from the authorities, they'd follow that to the letter, more or less, right? And now the SAB guidance is you can now explore this a little more. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I'm just sort of, it just loosens up the um it allows banks to get into the game essentially, and to start the process. And this is why we're, and it's so early still. Like this is just an early days conversation. You know, but
Even Canadian banks who are traditionally very conservative.
I don't know about Canadian banks. SAB is more of a US thing. I don't know where Canadian banks stand on it. Do you, Wasim?
Yeah, I think so. The US has made their position quite clear, right? They've already announced a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Hmm.
They just passed this week the Genius Act, which is also a play on stable coins. They've made some reforms on accounting rules that MicroStrategy has now taken advantage of, and I think you'll see in the next earnings report. The next earnings report, I think, is sometime in August, 53 or 54 days away from now, and I think you'll see MicroStrategy report some massive revenues because now they can actually, and I'll kind of defer this to Matthew to explain as the authority on accounting, but basically you can kind of look
Mark to
at
market.
your mark to market Bitcoin gains over the last quarter and track that as a revenue. And they're
Right.
actually, as long as Bitcoin can stay, as long as Bitcoin stays above 93-ish thousand dollars, MicroStrategy will effectively show 4 quarters of consecutive positive returns, which means they are actually primed for S&P inclusion. So
Mhm.
there's that's happened in the US. They've recently, so the Genius Act, as I mentioned as well. So there's a
Well,
lot of
let's
reforms.
just talk a little bit about what happens if you're S&P included. That means most asset managers around the world have to own it because if
Mm.
you're an asset manager and you own the index, which the majority of people do, majority of asset managers, that means indirectly you will have to own Bitcoin, which means there should be a lot more buying pressure into Bitcoin. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So just to circle back to Cam's question on Canada, I think Canada is way behind the US, unfortunately, at this point. Now that said, we were actually ahead, right? We actually Canada had the first Canadian legislated Bitcoin ETFs came in 2021. So we were actually ahead of the US. I know
Okay.
the US has significantly leapfrogged Canada. I don't know where we're going from here. And it's kind of sad because Canada actually has some of the best crypto foundations. Like Ethereum Foundation is out of Toronto. Solana has a massive presence in Toronto. The crypto environment is very vibrant in Montreal. There's a large base of companies that are functioning here in Canada. The regulatory environment is not very clear. The government has not been very, favorable to it. So I think there's opportunity there, but we'll see where that goes. But back to Omar's question, right on. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's some really, really interesting stuff going on there. So that you're absolutely, and recently, MicroStrategy was included in the QQQ, by the way. That was a bit of a non-event, but
Hmm.
Right.
MicroStrategy is now part of the Nasdaq, and so that means it's essentially picked up as part of the QQQ. So every purchase of a QQQ, some percentage goes to MicroStrategy, and the same will happen now if they get included in the S&P 500, which is so they will meet all of the. It is likely in the next 2 months that they will meet all of the criteria to be included in the S&P. Now, whether they are or not, that's a different argument, different question, different timeline. But they will check all the boxes for S&P inclusion, market cap, revenue, etc. I think there's like 5 or 6 different things.
So why don't
Well,
we
on
touch
the
on
accounting note, I think what we're just to jump in here for a second. So if you're going to classify Bitcoin as a financial instrument, which I think it's centered around that.
It's a commodity.
Yeah, so a commodity is a financial instrument as well, right? Then it's going to be considered for US GAAP purposes, for IFRS purposes. It's good. You'll take your gains and loss and include them in your income. Okay. Now this does two things, and companies may or may not be very fond of this. One is that you could have an EPS that goes to the moon, but it may be going to the moon for the wrong reasons. It's not because you're making more widgets. It could be because you've invested in Bitcoin, and then that's going to be compromising for a company that, hey, you're making widgets, but why is 8% of your EPS from Bitcoin, right? And companies don't like that. And in fact, in the mid 2000s, there's a whole bunch of hedge accounting standards that came out both in Canada and the United States, and are part of IFRS, or International Financial Reporting Standards, that the goal is to smooth out earnings, so that you can see, hey, what's the actual company making, but acknowledging that, yes, companies may invest in certain securities that are added to your income. Now, not all financial instruments go through your P&L and then hit your EPS, right? So, for example, if you're holding bonds, they are held at what's called amortized cost, right? So you put them on your balance sheet and they don't quite hit your P&L, or what's considered, if you ever look at financial statements, called FVTPL, fair value through P&L, right? You may have seen that in certain financial instruments, in certain financial statements, right? So there is, like, who doesn't want the EPS to go higher? Well, everyone wants that. But if your core business is not Bitcoin, like, i.e., if you're not MicroStrategy and you're like Microsoft, right? A different micro there, but very, very different businesses, like that, Microsoft may not want to have Bitcoin running through its P&L, but MicroStrategy may, right? So this really depends on the company and the accounting policy that they adopt. If you consider, I'm not too sure if this is possible, but I did read about it somewhere. If you consider Bitcoin to be inventory, well, inventory is always held at cost. You don't fair value inventory. So if you bought Bitcoin at $50,000 and you're considering it an inventory item, then yeah, it's going to be at $50,000, even if Bitcoin's at 10 million. Still going to be recorded at cost, right? So that's an extreme example, guys, but that's generally what the accounting standards say. So there is noise there, and I think that's going to be something that people start looking at to say, okay, how much of your EPS is from Bitcoin? Because the other things, like, you don't think that this is not different from currency. If when you look at a balance sheet, for example, guys, you'll see cash and cash equivalents. Well, guess what? All these companies, they have currencies all over the world. Like, just to pick on Microsoft for one example, but, like, they have operations like globally, right? But their balance sheet is denominated in US dollars, and obviously so is the income statement, right? So they would have converted all of their currency to US dollars, which is their reporting currency, in the same way that they would have to convert a Bitcoin. And that difference also will go through P&L, right? You'll see a line that says, translation from FX, and then that's what gives rise to, like, literally treasury departments whose job is to hedge this, right? So Bitcoin, I think, may follow a similar suit, but it could be more volatile and contribute to potentially higher or lower EPS. So, anyways, that's my accounting spiel. Hopefully, that kind of provides a little bit more clarity.
On the earnings per share side of things, like, what's the downside to having Bitcoin generate a higher earnings per share? If you were to say, if you got these companies like Microsoft, Meta, turning down putting Bitcoin on their treasury. Meta just had a vote on it, and they declined to proceed with it. And Microsoft, I think Michael Saylor had a presentation to the Microsoft board, and he did and they voted to not move forward with Bitcoin on their
But by
balance
like
sheet.
by like
As they should,
99% voted
as they
against.
should,
And why do you say that, Matthew?
because Meta's job is not to manage Bitcoin, right? Because let's people are buying Meta for advertising revenue from Facebook and Instagram, generally speaking, right? That's the
But
revenue
but
model.
hold on, like, from a financial solvency point of view, or profitability, if you're holding cash, like, how much cash is, like, Microsoft? Forgive me for going down this rabbit hole a
About
little bit, but
$100 billion.
$100 billion. Okay. You
That's
know,
depreciating annually.
right. That's where I'm going with this.
Well, well,
It,
how many orange pills have you swallowed?
you don't need to swallow any To know that the value of the dollar is going down, it's a fact.
Well, the idea of people holding currency on their balance sheet is that then they have the flexibility to expand their operations, right?
Right.
So Microsoft, it needs $100 billion on the balance sheet. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to do interesting things like, buy OpenAI for $10 billion.
Well, they could with if they had let's say they
Well, I know where you're going with this, Cam, and you're going to
okay,
say, "Hey, well, they could have, with Bitcoin, that could have been more easily done."
it could have just been done as easily, let's say, or maybe not as easily because cash is a little more easy to transfer to somebody for a purchase. If they wanted to just translate the Bitcoin into cash, they can do that instantaneously, pretty quite easily. There's no real hassle. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, over the long run, an appreciating asset like Bitcoin that's performing in a 4-year CAGR minimum 24%. I think this last 4 years has been the first 4 years that's actually not done that. But let's just take a 20% CAGR, 4-year compound annual growth rate. What is the benefit of having that on your balance sheet versus just cash? Like if you're making a 20% annual return on your savings, how does that affect the finances of your company? And in turn, bring this back to us as investors. Like, why does that matter? Why would that matter to me? What would that do to their balance sheet? And what would that do to their value of the company if they were instead of
I think
holding 100?
personally, I think it compromises the value of their company because the company is based on uh, technology, right? It's not based on currency or Bitcoin.
What about solvency or
Well,
solvency may not be
I
the right
mean,
word.
they hold US dollars. I
What
mean,
about, okay, not solvency, but what about just general financial health?
it's a question of what they're in the business of doing. So Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy, they've made it very clear that we have businesses, but one of our businesses significantly is to invest in Bitcoin and issue financial instruments that are denominated in Bitcoin. He's made that very clear, right? Which is cool. And if you're in for that, right? And I admittedly, I own some MicroStrategy. Absolutely. I'm on board with that. I also own Microsoft, right? But I'm not buying Microsoft uh, because of their Bitcoin exposure, right? I'm
Right.
buying Microsoft because I believe in the cloud. I'm buying Microsoft because I believe in their products. I believe in AI. I believe in their management team. I'm not buying Microsoft because I believe in Bitcoin. And that's
It, it,
that's what they have to really cater to at like these large publicly traded companies. They have to say, listen, is this going to be part of our mandate as a company of who we are or not?
Hmm.
I'd add to that as a little bit as well. And I kind of see, we're almost talking two different things here. So, I mean, one is, Cam's argument is, should a, a Mag 7 company hold or any large company that has cash on their balance sheet hold Bitcoin? And the argument to that is, well, if you don't, you're missing out on those potential returns. And as a capital allocator, your job is to kind of grow the value of the company, whether it be through acquisition or investment R&D, et cetera. That's your job. So if you're sitting on cash and, people criticize Warren Buffett for sitting on, what is it, $300 billion of cash right now, that's basically like holding a melting ice cube versus investing it in this, which could be giving you some reasonable return over and beyond the alternative, which is cash, right? So here's the cash return if you're holding money versus the Bitcoin return. So I think there's one argument there. That's quite a diverse kind of range of returns. Um, the other way to look at this, and this is the sailor point of view, is, actually, I would add to what you're saying. You're absolutely right, by the way, Matt. Like, it's not just that it's a diversified business. In fact, Sailor himself says that he's a zombie. He was a zombie business. Like, they were not growing. They're not going anywhere as a company, right? They know that. So they took the decision to say, okay, but we've got $700 million of cash on our balance sheet. What do we do with this thing? Like, do we just kind of pay ourselves and close down the company, or what do we do? Do we buy other companies? They were looking at how to get out of the situation they were in, which, by the way, is not uncharacteristic for the majority of S&P 500 companies. They're not growing at the same pace as an Amazon or a Google or an Nvidia. Most of them are not growing or growing very marginally. So how do you grow? Because ultimately that's what drives your returns. So another way to look at this, I find this perspective really interesting, right? Is because you often hear about Bitcoin being a protocol. It's found, and the word protocol, right? If I can visualize it, is foundations. So if I show you, you can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so here's where we are today. There was this thing called TCP/IP. Doesn't matter, some acronyms, right? Tech stuff doesn't matter, right? But this is the underpinnings of the internet. Everything is basically internet protocol. IP stands literally for internet protocol. There is a protocol layer, and all the protocol does is basically it's like a contract. Here's how we have decided collectively as a society we're going to communicate on this. On the information superhighway using a protocol called IP, just like we communicate for transacting money using something called SWIFT. So it's an agreement around how we're going to transfer data or value or or music or whatever. So Bitcoin is no different, except it is going to sit on top of this TCP/IP layer and offer you a way to transfer value.
It's not
So
going to. It is
it is.
currently.
Sorry, thank you for that correction. Yeah,
Yeah.
it already is, right? So and again, we don't want to get into the technical details of this network. It's really irrelevant. Like at the end of the day, every single one of us is a consumer, a user of these businesses. Everybody knows these companies. We use them every single day or very regularly. But the underpinnings of how they communicate to each other and how the data centers and how the data that you are using for your Netflix or your Apple subscription, how that actually traverses the internet, I don't think any of us care. It's as long
Hmm.
as it works, I'm good with that. I don't need to know the specifics and the details of TCP/IP and how all the interworkings and the DNS routers and all that. I really don't care. Some engineers taking care of that for me. And as long as it's up and working, like yesterday, I think there was some global outage, I think somewhere across the internet, but it was recovered. Things came back online. Life is good. So it's the same kind of logic here in the Bitcoin network. There is a protocol that underpins the layers on top. The key difference here is, and this is I think where Cam is coming from, is this is already substantially built up, and it is quite difficult for you to kind of get a slice of the action here. TCP/IP is an open source protocol. There's no monetization. There's no way to own it there. These companies are public companies. You can buy their stock. That's cool, right? So if they build on top of this infrastructure, this protocol, then so you said you like the fact that Microsoft and the business that they run. Well, the business they run is running on TCP/IP. Without this protocol, there is no Microsoft, right? So its foundations are TCP/IP. So if I draw the corollary here for Bitcoin, well, Bitcoin, you suddenly have an opportunity, and you can see. I mean, I think it's very well represented here. It's very, very green. We are very early. Like, the community service that Cam and I are doing to kind of get this message out to the Theta community is, these are early days, and these are actually some of the best days to get in. Even though, it's hard to fathom that Bitcoin is trading, what is it, 104,000 US today? That's actually a small investment. It's like, imagine, in the 40s or the 50s, somebody took you out to Nevada in the middle of a desert and said, see that plot of land right there? That's going to be gold one day. I'm suggesting that you buy a plot now. And you're saying, what do you think? Are you crazy, man? I'm not buying that. I'm not buying nothing in the middle of Nevada desert. And, fast forward 50 years from now, it's called Las Vegas, right? And it's worth a lot of, like, if you owned an acre on that strip, it would be worth a few dollars now. And that's the same logic here. But again, you need to be convicted on Bitcoin. You need to kind of do your homework. You need to kind of, unfortunately, do the work. Bitcoin is grounded in something called proof of work. You got to do the work. You have to kind of, read some books. You need to get convicted. You need to do we're providing a lot of content here on the Theta channel to try to give you, some of that to give you a leg up. And you've got access to any of us here to if you need more information. But it's an opportunity, right? And there are people that are going to jump on it, and there's others that are not. And that's at the end of the day, those are choices. But just to add a couple more things there, here's the performance of Bitcoin over the last 14 years. The numbers speak for themselves. It's not a straight line up. Clearly, there are dips. It's not like any investment, there's always risks. So we're certainly not saying there's no risk. We're certainly not saying there's no volatility. It is absolutely speculative. There is risk, absolutely. But this is where we have to do the homework, and I do the homework myself every day to reassess and make sure I haven't there's no blind spots. I haven't missed anything. I'm plugged into what's happening in the community to understand if there's anything that we should be concerned about as this asset base gets built out and becomes a global monetary asset. But the last thing I'll leave you with is this, right? And this is coming back to, okay, I mean, I totally hear your arguments here, Matthew, and I'm listening to you, Cam, as well. But, this is where, at the end of the day, this is the 1 year return. And let's even if you want to go back, to the BSC is like 2020 returns. I think this is from 2020 to today. Well, yeah, I mean, great. If you own Microsoft, well, you did extremely, extremely well. There's nothing to sneeze at with 129% return over the last 4 years. That's a very healthy, formidable return. But I kind of prefer this now. but that said, you've got to do your homework. And I see a question here in the chat about this being a Ponzi scheme. Yeah, and there's a lot of talk, and there's a lot of analysts out there looking at MicroStrategy and saying, "What the hell is going on with this thing?" Right? Why is this? Why does it have an MNAV that's more than Bitcoin? Why does it have there's all these parameters that you need to kind of double click on and understand.
Yeah, maybe, you said the word. Maybe we should talk a little bit
No,
about.
I knew you were
All
gonna go
right.
there, man. I shouldn't have said it.
You don't want to go there. The idea of
Well,
like just looking at value. I mean, I think it relates to sort of this conversation. I mean, modified net asset value, right? MNAV.
so before we go there, can
Okay.
I zoom out for a bit, right? Because I think recently, there was an important event that happened, right? So the Bitcoin conference happened in Vegas, and we'll come back to MicroStrategy, but I don't want to necessarily turn this into a MicroStrategy discussion, right? MicroStrategy is important, and it's part of the discourse that's happening in Bitcoin right now. But I think maybe we zoom out and then we zoom back in.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's zoom out for a sec. So what just happened, right? Bitcoin 2025. And if you go back to Bitcoin 2024, the conference last year happened in Nashville. The keynote speaker actually was Donald Trump. He was not the president at the time. He was just the presidential candidate. Many of these actors were also on stage with him. But this year, JD Vance was the keynote speaker. And this is the first sitting vice president to actually keynote the Bitcoin conference. There were 30,000 plus attendees in Vegas. So if you think it's a small conference, think again. Saylor, of course, is a keynote. Bo Hines is one of the executive directors for the president on digital assets. David Sachs is the crypto czar in the White House. Cynthia Lummis is one of the senators. So there's definitely some interest. And if you go down this list, there is quite a number of people that you probably recognize. So there is no shortage of interest in this space. So some of the key kind of announcements that came out from this conference is countries like Pakistan announced a strategic Bitcoin reserve, amongst others. There was other countries as well. So the interest is definitely building. This is the year where we talked about retail, we talked about institutional, corporate adoption, sovereign wealth adoption, family offices, pension funds are now plowing in. And again, I mean, you don't have to take it from me. You can actually go to Bitcoin treasuries. Cam, I said no charts, but you didn't say no websites, so I went to some. So,
Hey man, it's all for education. Let's go.
It's all for education. But it's all, the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is it's all public. There's nothing to hide. It's all public. It's all open source. You can go there and look for yourself, right? Don't take anything I say for granted. In fact, I would love to be challenged because I'm always looking for blind spots to validate, maybe there's something I have missed. Happy to somebody tell me you missed it. Here's the real reason it's going to fail. But so far so good. 139 companies owning 15.7% of the total 21 million. Because remember, 21 million is the supply limit of Bitcoin, never more than that. And you can see, I mean, it's quite a broad range of entities that own Bitcoin, and the interest is growing. Every time I come here, this number go up. This number started maybe a year ago at around like 5 or 6%. We're already at 15.
So let's just put that into some kind of context. So if 15, 16% of the Bitcoin in circulation right now, or is that of the 21 million, I guess in circulation right now, or that it's been mined so far, there's a remaining amount of 85%. So, something like 70% of all Bitcoin is held by individuals. And they're held off of exchanges. They're held in, they've been removed from the markets, and they're just being held in people's wallets. So, what's that? You're pointing to something there?
Yeah, the circulating supply, right? That's the number you're talking to. So that's basically
How
the
much?
total supply.
Yeah.
If you see it here. So maximum supply is 21 million, circulating supply is 19.87 and change.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, to your point, if you just go to, coin market cap, you actually see like if you look at Bitcoin analytics, it gives you a breakdown of, what we call the retail investors versus the whales, right? So you can see the whale holdings, like and a whale typically is, somebody who owns, I believe it's 100,000 or more Bitcoin.
Mm.
It's quite small relative to others, which, are small percentage. So this is where, the percentage of addresses that hold, up to, $1,000 of Bitcoin, it's quite small. The
$1,000 of Bitcoin.
$1,000, I'm sorry, $1,000, yeah, is significant. So this is where the retail
Right.
institution
So,
holding.
and why is that important? Because it's being held amongst a lot of people, right? A
Mm,
lot of individuals have made have made a decision to take possession of this asset. A lot of individuals, right? And so
that's right.
there's a peer-to-peer nature of Bitcoin that, it's this the most freest market out there because it's liquid, it's 24/7 trading 365 days a year. There are no, it's outside of the financial system, but it's becoming part of the financial system. And it's a commodity that people can own and take possession of. And, I just wanted to highlight that number because it's like, 15% of these companies, like they're getting all the attention, but really it's the quiet minority, not the minority, the quiet majority that are just sitting on this protocol and owning it and benefiting from the future gains and the ability to, the benefits of owning Bitcoin, which are, portability, transferability, scalability, like all the things that Bitcoin, the five key things in Bitcoin, right? Which are, we've talked about in previous shows, but like, um, it's not centralized by, three or four or five or 10 entities that now have control of this network and can make changes to it, right? And the protocol that Bitcoin is it's owned by many, 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 many people. And for this protocol to change, there has to be a consensus amongst, a large majority of, has to be a majority change to the protocol. So that just lends to the security. That's what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to point to where the security of Bitcoin comes from, and it's in the adoption by millions of people who have ownership over this thing. There is no one owner of Bitcoin. There's no one that's going to change this protocol. So a lot of I'm trying to say like a lot of the concerns that come with Bitcoin, people say, well, what is it? It's just a techno. It's not just a technology. This is a protocol that is owned by many individuals and requires consensus in order to change it. So, um, you know,
And you know what technology is at the end of the day. I mean, humans evolve because we are constantly innovating. We are a species grounded in technology. There's a reason the tech sector is one of the best performing sectors in the stock market, because people genuinely tend to invest in technology because it is a way for us to become more efficient. There was a point in time where you used to wash your clothing in the bathtub and now we have a washing machine. You throw it in there and you press a button and off you go and you go do other stuff, higher value stuff like watch Netflix. Um, but but to your point, like there is if you boil it down, like now you've touched on something more philosophical, and that is the concept of money, right? I mean, ultimately, and we've had this conversation before, but just to hash that out again quickly, what is money? I mean, ultimately, you spend time working, so you're expending energy, you're spending time. You want to translate that into something that you can store, money that you get
mm,
paid, compensated for that. You want to store that in something that can
mm,
generate for you either a gain or at least can preserve your hard-earned work. So you
mhm.
make a decision. Now you can put that in dollars and save it in the bank, and leave it there. That's perfectly fine. But we've all had this conversation before about inflation and how you're
Eroding value, devaluation of
eroding.
the currency. Yeah, we all
That's
know
right.
where your savings of your dollars will go, and mhm.
So you put it in the bank. That's absolutely an option for you. But you take the risk of losing monetary purchasing power, and so you're incentivized to do something with it, to invest
Right.
it, and
You're
this
you're
is
sorry to interrupt you. I'm just jumping on there, but it's like
no, please.
you're required to invest it, right?
You're
Otherwise,
required. Yeah.
you are absolutely required to invest it. If you do not learn this investing world, then you are just going to become poorer and poorer over each year. You have to
Yeah. I
buy a
mean,
home, or you're going to monetize real estate, and we all know where that's going, right? Where people are being priced out of just basic living expense, being able to afford a home, right? Because real estate's become the place. where people put their money so that they can maintain a retirement, right? Well, Bitcoin is changing that game, changing what the world of where you put your wealth, where you put your monetary value. Um, and
And
that is,
REITs are perfectly fine. They generate a return, right? That return, we can argue if it's good enough or if there's something better, but that's a choice, and based on your risk profile, based on your comfort level, to your point, Cam, right? It's not an option not to invest. You need to invest, and many of us do invest. Maybe we just don't know it. You've implicitly bought a home, and you'd say, okay, now I feel a little bit more safe, but you feel safer because you've invested your hard-earned money in a property, some physical thing. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, and maybe the majority of people will just stay there. That's it. That's at the end of their investment journey. But for others, they're going to say, well, but I want more, right? So I'm going to put some in gold. I'm going to put some in, the NASDAQ. I'm going to put some in Mag 7. I'm going to buy some Bitcoin. And, those are choices people make. So all we're presenting here is a choice. So, there is an emerging asset class. It's called digital assets. Bitcoin is extremely scarce, and that scarcity we've talked about as well. The scarcity is right there. Like that's the number that Cam was talking about. It's not changing, at least not easily. There is a massive deployment base of nodes that are protecting. There's a massive deployment of miners that are protecting this network. So can you change this code? Absolutely, you can change this code. Is it easy to create the network effect to get everybody to adopt the new software technology? No, it's not. That's like you creating your own Facebook and saying, hey, forget the real Facebook. I've got a better one over here. Come over here. So, yeah, okay. I'm sure you'll get a few people. But will you bring over the entire Facebook community? Well, you got to have a pretty damn compelling reason why others would follow you into that environment. You got to have something much better to offer than the existing Facebook for people to really jump off the real Facebook and onto your Facebook. Same applies here. So this max supply is real, and as much as you kind of, and don't take my word for it. It's right here. And if you want to see it live, it's right here. Like go to Clark Moody, and you can see the actual Bitcoin supply. There's the real number, and there's 3.125 being minted every block. It's real. Like this is the real money supply of Bitcoin, and you can track it in real time. This is the fundamental difference. Unlike the existing monetary system, there is no way for you to track the real money supply today in real time. I mean, sure, you can track it on a spreadsheet, a week or two or a month later, but in real time, it's very difficult. We're not real time.
and like, we're moving into it. Technology is the world where we're going, and having this
Yeah.
real-time ledger system that is transparent is what the protocol level allows for this changing world that we're entering with AI, with technology, right? When you have a ledger that is secure, a protocol that is just pure access through energy and electricity and through the internet. This is the foundation of like the world that we know is coming, right? Where speed and so there needs to be a monetary unit of account that can plug into this coming, and that's Bitcoin. Imagine how people were looking at the internet early on, right? In the 80s and 90s, and investing in the internet companies was considered insane, right? Well, who's laughing now, and who's those who invested in the early days were winners. And we're not trying to advocate here to buy it. Just what you have to look at this as a reality of the world. And at least you've got Paul Tudor Jones talking about allocating to all the major hedge fund managers. Many of the major hedge fund managers are talking about, investing a portion of it into your portfolio. People are trading it right now. A lot of people are like, I've run into a number of people who are like, no, I think it's time to get out of this asset now. We're at an all-time high. I'm going to cash out and I'm going to wait. And I think they're going to get their faces ripped off, in terms of they're buying, they're trying to get back into the game, right, at a lower price. And I think it's a fool's errand. I think you want to buy this thing, you want to stick this in, your possession and own it and hold it for 4 years plus and enjoy the benefit that it gives you as an asset. And then it allows you to access some of these other companies that are using Bitcoin on their balance sheet, like MicroStrategy or IBIT as an ETF, or you name the company, you name the asset. Um, Understanding the financial world through a Bitcoin lens allows you to invest in these companies with a different paradigm, right? Like with you have an advantage. Let's put it that way. You have an advantage of seeing things that not the rest of the financial market can't see. So I just
There,
encourage people to read about it, learn about it, let it become part of your view on the world, and allow it to inform some of your decisions.
uh, Totally, I totally agree. I mean, if anything, it's just the education value of it, right? And any new technology. I mean, right now, let's just kind of park the Bitcoin discussion for a second. We heard a lot about AI. AI is an emerging technology. Any new emerging technology, even historically, if you go back there was a point in time where people feared um, fire. There was a point in time where people
Hmm.
feared electricity. There was a point in time where people feared the automobile, right? And they were happy with their horses. But at some point, technology is consumes everything. So
Hmm.
whether if you choose to embrace it or not, it will engulf you, right? I mean, whether you agree or disagree with the internet, well, it's part of your life now.
Yeah,
Took 20 years to get here, but here we are.
So I'm going to ask you guys a question. Who is this not for?
it's a good question. It's
I would actually let me stop sharing here for a second. That's a very good question, Matthew, right? And sometimes here in in the G7 in the Western countries that we are in, we take comfort in the fact that we do have access to hard assets. Many of us own real estate on this group. Many of us are talking about investments and having the opportunity to have a good job and be able to take that money and park it into something that is appreciating in value. But we are the wealthy minority, not the global majority. So if you kind of zoom out and look at, well, where do most people stand? And well, the reality of the world is most people, 50% of the planet is unbanked. They don't even have a bank account, right? The majority of people have no access to these kinds of investment vehicles, right? Somebody that lives in, let's call it, rural Africa, or even in, in some countries in, like China or India, the kind of highly populous countries, they may not have access to US dollars like you and I. We just go down the street to the Royal RBC and pull it out of the ATM. That's not an option for people living in Venezuela, right? It's actually a crime in some countries to own US dollars. So suddenly, for you and I, it's a let's call it a first world problem, right? It's a luxury for me to have this opportunity to invest in Bitcoin.
we're privileged. We have
We
immense
are,
privilege in
yeah.
being in the system that is dominant throughout the financial world. We're living in that world, and we're the beneficiaries of being in that world.
And we're debating the store of value versus the monetary value versus the returns, etc. And that's all cool. It's all good,
Hmm.
right? It's just a circumstance of where we are, and the privilege that we have living in a country like Canada or in the Western countries. But there are many people that don't have that privilege, right? And the reality is, so there's a lot of arguments about, the fact that Bitcoin is already a monetary asset. People are already using it for exchange of goods because there is no other option. Look at Lebanon as an example, right? I mean, the devalue, or Egypt, or many of these countries that have basically a defaulted on their currencies. Well, what is the alternative? The alternative obviously is US dollar, is the global reserve currency. That's a no-brainer. But well, what if the US dollar is not really an alternative? It's illegal. It's hard to get. You can only buy it on the black market for ridiculous, exchange rates. So people are genuinely looking for alternatives. One alternative could be gold, or one alternative could be digital gold.
Right.
Well, I think so. It's an interesting. See, this is actually goes even back to the accounting concept, but I'm not going to make it that boring. What because it's really so we in the Western world we are dealing with Bitcoin, and I'm not investing in MicroStrategy because I want to have access to a different currency, right? I am
Right.
buying MicroStrategy because I want to have access to Bitcoin and the capital appreciation I may experience from Bitcoin,
Sure.
right? Which is very different than a country with a failed currency
Right.
that almost has to resort to Bitcoin to be the official currency, right? And that could be a currency that has been either tremendously devalued, no longer considered viable internationally, even a currency that fluctuates very heavily. That, all of those countries, they could be candidates to adopt Bitcoin. So
Right.
there's a different investment purpose, right? And in fact, one is not an investment. right? So I would say that in the countries where, you do have a, let's just call it a generally compromised currency.
Hmm.
Yes, Bitcoin may be a solution, and in fact, it has been, right? That we've seen a handful of countries adopt Bitcoin as I think El Salvador did, didn't they? Uh,
El
Yeah.
Salvador did, yes.
I think, and is Venezuela on the cusp of it, or I don't
They
know.
are. There's several countries that are looking at it,
Yeah.
yes.
So that makes actually some sense. That makes some sense, right? Um,
So
but
there's multiple. Let me just jump in there for a sec, Matthew. There's multiple use cases for Bitcoin, right? And Wasim correctly, went to the unbanked solution and the solution that Bitcoin provides to the unbanked as, in that conversation. When you asked him, who's this not for? I think the answer is I don't think there's anybody it's not for. I think it's for the world. And I'm jumping ahead here, but the solutions that Bitcoin provides are different for different people and for different reasons, right? And it solves really it's a ledger that is transparent. It's an honest ledger is really what it is. And that anyone can access, that is protected and bounded by energy at a protocol level, that is uncorruptible, that has a limited supply. And that use case is becoming more and more valuable. And being it's not it's so let me put it this way. Bitcoin's use case was there from the beginning. It was born with a use case. But the adoption of it is what's has grown, right? Has grown substantially over those 13, 14 years, however many years it's been now, since 2009.
2009.
Um, you know, it's still the same thing. I mean, there's been some slight changes along the way due to consensus, but that's but the main purpose of Bitcoin was was created a long time ago, and it's only being recognized as higher value of a value as time goes on. And so, like, it doesn't have to do anything else to be valuable.
I
It's
well,
would,
just
I,
I mean, the one I'm getting at is actually like, what about a person that's 80 years old? Do they need
yeah,
Bitcoin exposure?
that's where
okay.
I was going to go, right?
That's a great
And,
question.
and, and I don't
That,
know that they
that's
do.
No, that's where I was going to go right now. And I would argue actually that, there is a use case for somebody that is looking for fixed income, right? Because ultimately you're looking for a way to preserve your wealth and at minimum preserve your wealth, right? And even at 80 years old, you still need to kind of see, your income come in until the end of your life. So, the reason you've invested is that so, in your years where you're not earning money that you can actually spend from the money that you've saved or invested over time. That's the whole point of investing, is it not?
It
Other than
is, but there's
generational
also
wealth and make
in
money,
your
but
later years, there's also a concept of like preservation of capital, right?
absolutely.
And if you have returns that are 20, 30%, so all of us are young enough to say, okay, in 10 years, I'm going to be around and I'm okay with these returns. But if you're 80 years old, for example, you may not have that time horizon to say, okay, supposing our friend in the South says, I hate Bitcoin, right? And says, all these executive orders, I'm tearing them up because, China did something bad. I mean,
Yeah.
don't
It
tell
wouldn't
me
be
it's
it wouldn't be
not.
too far removed for him to do something like that, right?
Yeah,
Honestly.
it's not
So
inconceivable, right? And suddenly Bitcoin goes down to $50,000, right? I'm
right,
just,
let me let me share something here on that note, right? So a couple of things. One is, and we'll come back to, I think this is probably a good way to come back to MicroStrategy a little bit. And I'm going to use it based on the question you asked, like who's Bitcoin, who is not well served by owning Bitcoin? And that's your question, right? It's a very fair question. So I gave you,
well,
I gave
I think the question is it suitable? Who is it
suitable.
not
Yeah.
suitable for?
Fair, very valid question, right? So let me answer the question this way. So I gave you the example of the unbanked and those that may have a need to use it as opposed to a want. Like many of us here are having this conversation and we're talking about a want. Do I want to invest in it? Do I need to make 140% return, or am I happy with my 10%? So let me answer the question this way. This is a picture of, and I've shared this before, right? Kind of the global asset foundation of the planet, and where kind of, let's call it the 1,000 trillion, 900 trillion. That's kind of there floating in the world, where is it allocated? And we've seen this before, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, obviously a ton of it is in real estate, no surprise, right? A ton of it is in the bond market. The bond market is, and this is why, you know, I think Omar, you know, you and Matthew, you guys, you talk about the bond market a lot and interest rates. Why? Because it affects this big block over here, and because it affects this block over here, right? The bond market is, you know, 3 times bigger than the equity market. That's a substantial amount of money that's locked up in these things called bonds, right? This is government treasuries and corporate treasuries. So the reality is Bitcoin is a tiny, you know, drop in the bucket relative to the global asset base of the planet. And, you know, this is $2 trillion. And I think this morning, what we just looked at it, right? It was like $2.1 trillion. It's tiny. It's nothing, right? So your question is, why do people need this? Well, I would ask the question, well, why do people need this? Well, why do people need this? Right? So these are different asset classes for you to preserve your wealth and generate either preservation of value or growth of value. That's why you invest. That's why there's $900 trillion locked up in here. Now, for the 80-year-old that may not necessarily need, you know, a healthy return because you know, they just want to make sure that they preserve their wealth. Absolutely. Then you would probably invest in bonds. Bonds recently have not been performing very well, and I think that's part of the challenge here, right? If you go and look at, you know, the bond market has been generally performing okay, but you can argue that it's really not been performing relative to, you know, the debasement of the monetary system. Like if you factor in inflation in real,
Yeah.
then you could actually say you're kind of treading water or you're behind potentially.
Yeah.
So, and recently the bond market has not been doing great. So
Yeah.
so this is where, to answer your question, so somebody who's living on fixed income and they want to guarantee that they're going to have an opportunity to get some returns on their capital invested, do you want vehicles that will guarantee a return? Well, okay, this is kind of where we break into, well, this is where MicroStrategy comes back in again. This is the capital stack of MicroStrategy. Now, I know it's shaped like a pyramid, and people are going to say, oh, it's obviously a pyramid scheme, it's a Ponzi. And I saw a question on that. We'll come back to that in a sec. But this is the capital structure of Bitcoin, of MicroStrategy, and the products that they are releasing in the market. So let me just talk about Strife for a second. And this is not, I'm not doing a marketing pitch. I'm just stating some facts about, you know, what products are coming on the market that are anchored on Bitcoin as a capital asset class.
Mhm.
Strife as a product is 10% fixed income, dividend paid out quarterly, guaranteed returns, full stop. If you want 10%, right, then you go to Strife. So if you are 80 years old and you want guaranteed 10% on your money that you have invested, you've got $1 million invested and you want guaranteed 10%, you absolutely have the option of putting it in a bond, right? I'm not taking that away, right? And most people do. Real estate, that doesn't necessarily give you 10%. Bonds they used to, but not much guarantees anymore. And you can see it in the numbers, right? Bond market returns, you know, US total bond market, you're barely scraping 2% on average. So
Yeah, there's a lot of different products that can produce returns, you know, of 10% or 12% a year, you know, mortgages, private mortgages, or if you're on the stock market, you can, you know, like covered call ETFs, things like that, different products that are out there. And you're just pointing to one that has, you know, is within the MicroStrategy framework, right?
I am exactly right. So and you know that if you look at it, Strife, that's exactly what it does. It does a 10%. I mean, this is the strategy website, 10% dividend yield,
Hmm.
and it's a now we can argue about the guaranteed part of it, right? They will it's a guaranteed payout of 10%, and you can see how it's structured. You can do your homework, right? Don't take it from me, but that's how they've advertised it, right? And do your homework, right? But there is suddenly an alternative materializing on the markets called Strife, and the interesting thing is, you know, if you go to the market and you look at Strife, well, you know what? It's an ETF. You can go buy it. It's a MicroStrategy Incorporated 10% Series A perpetual preferred stock, which means and Matthew, please explain to me what does a Series A perpetual preferred stock mean in the capital stack?
Well, it should have a higher what's the word I'm looking for? Creditor status. And if it's perpetual, it means it's going to be paying this indefinitely. I would ask that, okay, you know, are these, I mean, like, first of all, look at the prospectus, right?
Absolutely.
Definitely look at that. See
Not financial advice.
No,
This is
yeah.
just sharing
Definitely
information
look
here.
at see is this is the 10% return of capital? I'm just looking at offline here, and like I mean, this product only came into existence less than 60 days ago.
Well, you can see it. It's here's the
Yeah,
ticker, right? March.
yeah,
Yeah.
And they created Strike, and they created another one just very recently called Stride, STRD. I think it's literally
right.
launching like today. Right, that sits right here in the
So be
capital
very
stack.
careful what these. I don't. I'm an investor in MicroStrategy. I have not vested in Strike or Stride, but I would be very curious to see how they plan on fulfilling the 10% uh, dividend perpetually.
Absolutely. Do your homework
Yeah,
100%. But all I'm highlighting here is there is a whack load of new financial products that are launching on the market, all of them anchored on Bitcoin. So
right.
I would not discount this whole fine. You want to call it a movement, you want to call it a trend, you want to call it new technology, speculative, like
Well, it
all
is it is speculative just
it
by
is
the nature of the
absolutely speculative.
volatility of the return, right? So going back to your 80, now first of all, if you're in your 50s and your 60s and you have a high risk tolerance, this could definitely be in your wheelhouse of
Hmm.
stuff you want to invest in, right? But just based on the volatility of returns, if you do need a lot of money, if you do have cash flow requirements, you may or may not want to jump into one of these products, right? But that being said, um, could this be it is, in my opinion, another form of currency, right? You do see more and more um, entities accepting Bitcoin as payment, right?
Absolutely.
And that, I mean, that is very encouraging, right? Because you want to see more liquidity, and you want to see, for example, like if you buy Microsoft, and let's kind of use a close quarter set of examples, you are also buying the US dollar because Microsoft trades in US dollars,
Right.
right? You buy US dollars and then you buy Microsoft, right? And if you can, but in the same manner, Bitcoin can act the same and get you similar exposure if you want exposure to Bitcoin, right? So it really depends on what exposure you want, in my opinion, right? And
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
if but like at the end of the day, I think that Bitcoin does well when more people accept it as another form of currency,
So
not
I'll give you an
necessarily a store of value.
so I'll give you an example. Yeah, yesterday I was talking to my neighbor who's actually doing some work in their backyard, and they're putting up a fence. And he came over to me and said, "I just got the contract from the fence guy, and he says he accepts Bitcoin." So
The fence guy.
a fence guy, yeah, next door to me.
Wow.
And I know
Now,
down the
now,
street.
hold on. Now, the
Yeah.
accountant in me is thinking, is this just a way to say I accept cash?
Well, absolutely. Well, that's what you said. You said
And
you
don't
want
charge
you
me
want
HST?
you want Bitcoin to get more monetary sort of global adoption and more have become more of a monetary base, and you want to see people adopting it, right? That's kind of a metric that you're using, a lens that you're using to get a little bit more comfortable with it. And
Yep.
I'm just saying, I can go to Tahini's down the street, which is a shawarma place. You guys have in Toronto too. They accept Bitcoin for shawarma purchase.
That's the gentleman we met in Montreal, right?
Yeah. I mean, don't take it. Go to Tahini's, and this is the.
Yeah.
I'm not doing advertising for him, but Tahini shawarma, and you'll see that they accept Bitcoin. Like, they take Bitcoin. So it's it's coming, right? That's all I'm saying. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not, and I would argue it's not just coming. It's already here.
Guys,
So
let's address some of the questions. There's some good ones in the
Yeah,
chat.
there's a few
We're going to
questions
run
here.
out of
Yeah.
time before we can get to them. Anthony asks, how about a DCA strategy whereby you dollar cost average in, then trim maybe 5 to 10% upon all-time highs and buy more aggressively on the dips, but continuous accumulation? Thoughts on that, Wasim?
yeah, absolutely. I think it's an excellent strategy to DCA
On,
on
on the same
on
on a
Bitcoin.
similar note, are you advocates of buying IBIT, or are you advocates of buying Bitcoin in a cold wallet?
There's another
So
question coming on that.
Oh, there is? Okay, okay.
Yeah, there's a question that
Yeah.
deals with just
Anthony.
that. So I think
Okay.
that's a great idea, Anthony. I don't see any problem with that
100%.
whatsoever.
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
another question from Anthony. What factors or conditions
Can
would
I, sorry, Cam, can I add one thing to that though? So if you
please?
DCA, and most people DCA on an exchange like Newton or ShakePay or Coinbase or whatever, right? So just make sure you move it off exchange and put it onto some sort of storage, like cold storage, right? So don't leave it. If you DCA, all I'm saying is don't leave it on the platform, on the exchange platform.
Yeah, those are just
Not your keys, not your coins. Like don't leave it there. You don't own it until you move it and you take possession.
yeah, okay, great. And so maybe we can just jump to the second question, which is kind of ties into right into that. I'll just jump over the bigger question there, and then Anthony asked, "What are the advantages of buying Bitcoin in a wallet versus buying an index?" To kind of more further to this point, what are the advantages of buying Bitcoin in a wallet versus buying in an index like IBIT or GBTC? You know, the advantages are security, essentially.
Well, security is one for, I mean, so but let me come back to this view here for a second, right? So if I just share that picture that I showed earlier, so even MicroStrategy, not this picture here, like even MicroStrategy, right? That have so underpinnings of MicroStrategy is Bitcoin, so they buy Bitcoin, and you can see it on on their accumulation stack here, right? Sorry, the history, I think it is. Where is it? Yeah, you see that. Where did they buy it? They actually show the purchases. There it is, purchases. Yeah, so you see it there. They are buying Bitcoin and they're putting it there today on 582,000. So even as an individual, if you buy spot BTC, whether you DCA or you buy it directly on exchange and move it to your wallet, sure. If you're comfortable with that and you need to make sure that you understand how to do that, then and you know how to safeguard it, then absolutely, that is definitely an excellent strategy, because then you have real access to owning a piece of the digital real estate of the future, right? You own and this is an important chart, you have potential for ownership of the
Yeah.
Bitcoin network. So by actually owning Bitcoin, right, and self-custodying it, yes, you are buying a piece of the future. I don't know, but Las Vegas is a terrible example. I should have picked a
Yeah.
better city. It's not a gambling town, but you get the idea. Manhattan, how about it? Manhattan,
There you go.
right? You
Manhattan's the
get to
classic
buy a
one. Yeah.
piece of Manhattan today before all the buildings came up, right? You're buying a piece of real estate there. So, and we're real estate investors. So, this is a piece of digital real estate. You have access to it today. Now, if you have a registered portfolio, TFSA, RESP, whatever, RRSP, obviously owning Bitcoin in a registered account is impossible. There's no mechanism for you to do that. Then in that case, then yeah, IBIT is an excellent alternative, right? So if you and it's not just IBIT, by the way. So if I kind of look at ETFs, there are a number of ETFs. The biggest one is BlackRock's IBIT, which is the one you were talking about here. But there's no shortage. I mean, there's tons of different ETFs and different ways to access and have a position on Bitcoin. So doing it through the ETFs is one way. Doing it through a public company. Let me just go back up here. These are public companies, MicroStrategy obviously being one. There's many others. Tesla actually owns some Bitcoin, right? They have. So by owning Tesla, technically, you have some exposure to Bitcoin. So
Yeah.
these are all proxies.
So let me just jump in there. So here's an analogy for you. Having Bitcoin in your possession is like owning real estate and having the keys and you own that property.
100%.
Versus if you have it on an exchange, that's like having leased land where you own a property on leased land, or, a co-op, or, you don't fully own the asset. It's sort of, you have rights to the asset, but the actual custody of that asset is under somebody else's domain. That's essentially the difference. Like if you like to own real estate, you want to own it yourself, right? Like I do
Okay,
personally.
that's a good analogy, Cam.
I want to have
That is
all
a very
my
good
ownership
analogy,
of it, right?
yeah.
And so, I think that's what you need to consider. There are some risks with holding it yourself that you got to make yourself comfortable with. And there are some challenges from a technological point of view that you've got to get comfortable with. Holding Bitcoin on your phone on a wallet is only, you're not quite there yet. You're not quite
Yeah.
there yet. You really need to learn the next level, which is really the biggest problem with Bitcoin. I got to tell you, is like the technological challenges with getting it into your own possession. It's not
Yeah,
easy.
and I think I was going to say, Cam, I think that's what turns most people, is because they're fearful they may forget their code, or I don't know where I put them, like that poor guy in England who is still
Who's
searching that
rummaging through the garbage dump
Right.
right now
rummaging
still
through
with
garbage. Exactly
hundreds of
right. So
Bitcoin on a Bitcoin
So
wallet
so that's
stuck in the
that's a
garbage
very
dump.
correct.
it's a very good point, Omar, right? And I would agree with you that there's improvements that we see coming, and part of this is human conditioning. Like we are conditioned. I
Mm.
mean, you've got all your money custodied at the bank, right? You're
Mm.
happy giving all your money to the bank, TD or whoever you're dealing with, right? You're comfortable to give up that responsibility of ownership with some layer of security on top of it and some insurance, and some safeguards that your money is protected. So you're kind of giving up your responsibility to take personal ownership of your assets to somebody else.
Yeah.
That's how we've
This,
dealt with it as a society, right? But then your trust levels, I mean, there are banks in the US every year that go belly up and you lose your funds, or at least the insurance will pay you out if it's less than 250,000 in the
To a
US,
certain extent.
to a
Yeah.
come
certain
on.
extent. But there is a risk factor there. It's no different than you investing in a company and the company goes bankrupt. I mean, you've entrusted this company with your capital, but there's no guarantees you get your money. But
Right.
that's
Yeah.
the
Like,
solution
so,
we've adopted in society is we give up that ownership, transfer it to a third party, and that's why we have counterparty risk. Bitcoin says no, you are self-sovereign. You need to take personal responsibility. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a divide that we need to bridge. We're not, and it's improving, but there's a lot of work to do there still.
yeah, one of the challenges is really, you need to understand sort of what Bitcoin is, what you're holding when you're holding Bitcoin, how that works. And that's maybe like something you need to do some research on if you're thinking about, well, how do I take possession of this thing? You need to
Hmm.
understand what you're actually holding, and do a little bit of research on that. Do some video work around, search YouTube for like, what is Bitcoin actually,
There's tons of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another question here.
Can I just add one thing to Anthony's question because he's
Sure.
really really good about like DCAing and kind of GBTC and ETF. So hopefully we answered a little bit on the ETF side, but I just want to draw your eye to a couple of other options, right? So and again, it's a risk. It's different levels of risk here. So you've got fixed income at the top if you want to use MicroStrategy products or buy BTC directly, or you do options. Like this group understands options, so you can even do options on MicroStrategy. That's another way of getting some exposure. There's options there on how you generate or gain exposure. Some of the other products that are coming up in the markets that are, again, not financial advice, do your homework, but just to give you a flavor for what is out there, right? You look at products like MSTY, and Matthew, there's an interesting why not for generating not fixed income, but a significant return. These guys do covered call strategy on MicroStrategy, right? So we all know what covered calls are. MSTY and another one that recently launched called IMST does covered call strategies on MSTR. Um, but
And
look
you
at,
can do products that are on Bitcoin ETFs alone. So
of
like,
course, on IBIT. Yeah,
on IBIT, yeah, or
yeah, yeah.
various. There's a few Canadian ones.
There
Anthony's
are.
actually, there's some people on this call who are using them a lot as
But look at the return on some of this. Now, I'm not promoting this, not suggesting you do your research. This is just purely, not financial advice, but just do your research. But I'm just trying to highlight the innovation that's happening in some of these financial products that are coming up, and all of these are anchored on Bitcoin ultimately, right? So look at their distribution monthly. This is a 30-day yield monthly, right? This is annual. You're talking like 1.47 dollars per US per share paid out monthly. And here's their distribution history, MSTY, and then IMST is more recent. They just launched very, very recently, I think like 60 days ago. They're very, very fresh. But again, these are easy purchases because it's an ETF. So
easy
imagine the amount
purchases.
of
There is more risk with these than other
oh,
products.
absolutely. There's a
There's
lot
a
more risk.
decay element to these
Yeah.
products. What to call,
These are not long-term holds, right? Absolutely
yeah,
not. But
yeah.
I'm just trying to kind of
I know. I
showcase
understand.
the diversification of options out there. All of them are underpinned on a Bitcoin-based capital allocation.
Their products on top of Bitcoin.
Right.
Um, so this question let's get to this question from Anthony. What factors or conditions would have to prevail to completely destroy Bitcoin and render it a failed experiment? Just trying to understand the ultimate bear situation and whether this is even possible. That's a really good question. I have two things to say that I'll just like store of value. Bitcoin needs to maintain its store of value status and become a medium of exchange. Like further to Matt's point, that is the risk that Bitcoin has in the long run. In the long run, if it fails as a medium of exchange, it may not continue, and that's truthfully not something I fully comprehend. I got to be honest with you. Even as I say that, this is coming from guys like Jeff Booth, who I follow
Yeah, yeah,
closely, and
I'd agree.
um,
Yeah, and the reason you're saying that is because there's really three elements. So to become money, there's really kind of three fundamental kind of uh, things that need to happen, right? So store of value, right? So
mhm,
first of all, you need to trust. There needs to be a
right,
trust factor. Then store of value, because I'm not gonna put my value in something I don't trust, right? Like gold is a good example of that. I trust gold. People trust gold. Everybody knows what gold is, right? I'm gonna use it as a store of value. So therefore, I'm gonna put my hard-earned money into it and
yeah,
to preserve my wealth. Now, medium of exchange is the next one. So you can absolutely sell gold and transact in gold, right? Just like you can do with the US dollar or other currencies. So there's a medium of exchange. I'd agree with you. And the last one is unit of account,
hmm,
which is things get priced in it. So as an example, like US oil or commodities are priced, sorry, oil or commodities are priced in US dollars. And most commodities are priced in US dollars. So at some point, you want to see the natural progression of Bitcoin from trust to store of value to a medium of exchange to unit of account. Now, to Cam's point, again, putting the Western lens on, right, the developed world, we are kind of between trust and store of value. Very few people are using it for medium of exchange. There are some, the fence guy next door, Tahini's down the street. There's a
yeah,
few areas where you can start to see medium of exchange, but it's absolutely not dominant.
yeah,
But again, if you zoom out and look at the global view, there are countries that have a failed currency. They don't have access to dollars, and they need to find a way to exchange. And Bitcoin,
mm.
and more specifically, stable coins have become a mechanism to enable that. So I think if we zoom out, there are countries that are already using it as a medium of exchange. It's just for us, it's not common because we have Interac and we have wire exchange and we have 100 other ways to exchange value. We don't have to use Bitcoin, but it's there if we want to.
Um, Anthony
But
asked,
I don't know if we answered Anthony's question though, right? So
well, there's
Anthony's question is, yeah.
that could be a long
So
conversation.
I
I
would
just
say
kind of
just
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I was just gonna say one thing. Like the only way you can turn off Bitcoin is, I mean, sure, if there's a vulnerability and people talk about quantum computing and all that, sure, that's a threat, but that's a bigger threat than just Bitcoin. Like if quantum
Bigger threat
computing
to the
becomes a
banking industry,
yeah,
right?
yeah, like it'll destroy our entire internet as we know it, and our trades, the way we trade. So it's a bigger
which is not,
problem.
which is probably not going to happen.
Well, you know what? Actually, I think it will happen. It's just a function of when. But the reality is, just like any other security vulnerability or technological advancement, we'll find a solution for it. So there are already, there's research going into cryptographically sound algorithms that are quantum resistant. So we already have some sort of research going into how do we build algorithms in addition to the SHA-256 algorithm that we have today that's prevalent across the network that will be quantum resistant. There are solutions for that. We just haven't implemented them because there's really no need to, right? So we're already thinking about technological solutions that can address that problem. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, yeah, I mean, attack vectors like, collusion from sovereign countries to say, okay, we're going to bring this network down. Very possible. It's not impossible. But for them to do that, they would have to spend 1 year of their GDP collectively to build an ASIC farm that's big enough. They would have to buy every single ASIC chip on the planet for the next year, build out a network so they can attack the Bitcoin network and create a 51% attack on Bitcoin, which they can absolutely do. I'm not saying they can't do, but you'd have to get all the countries in the world to agree to divert all of their money to build an ASIC farm big enough that can attack the Bitcoin network. And even then, they would hijack the network for a few blocks, and then we would build out a separate chain. It's software. That's the beauty of software, and then move off of that. And the third option is they can turn off the internet. That is
Which that's what I mean. That's not going to happen. There's no way
it,
they're going
it,
to turn off the internet.
it's possible. You
Yeah,
could
I'm sure it's
destroy
possible.
Bitcoin by turning off,
Yeah,
not destroy, but you could pause Bitcoin because at some point you have to bring it back up again.
yeah, but to turn off the internet is not a feasible solution, right?
I'm just answering Anthony's question.
I
Can it be
understand.
done? It can be done. What is the cost to doing that?
Yeah. Let's just deal with one more question here, maybe, guys, and wrap it. If we see John, well, we could take a couple questions, but this one from John. I know someone that got his house robbed, and they took his cold storage. I love this question. I love this comment because I mean it really illustrates like so someone came in and took the cold wallet, right? That's not a security risk unless I don't have my my 12 seed phrases,
My key.
my
Yeah.
key to
Yeah.
access that wallet in either in my mind. I could hold it in my head. I could hold it on a titanium plate. I can stamp it on a plate. I could stamp it on a steel plate. I could hold it in a safety deposit box in a bank. However you want to hold. I wouldn't recommend the last one there, but however you want to hold your. There's lots of ways to hold it. So the cold card does not actually hold the cold wallet, the cold storage does not actually hold your Bitcoin. It just holds the keys to your Bitcoin. And to get your keys to your Bitcoin, you have a 12 seed phrases. So all you need to do is commit those 12 seed phrases to memory if you're inclined to do so and believe your brain's going to hold that for the rest of your life. Or you hold it in a very secure way in the code, the 12 seed phrases on some piece of metal that can withstand any natural disaster, fire, or water, anything like that. Um, and that's really how you don't want to keep those two things together. You don't want to keep your seed phrases next to your cold storage in the same location because that would be a disaster. That would be the robber could then, if they can figure it out, they can get your access to your Bitcoin that way.
Yep.
So just keep that in mind.
I just wanted to just touch on Anthony's points here, right? So yeah, on the covered call ETFs, don't disagree, Anthony. I'm not suggesting or promoting MSTR, IMST, or any of these covered call ETFs, right? You're right. There is a, you've got a balance, and that's why I say they're not necessarily long-term holds if you do them, right? You got to balance the gains or the over time, the overall return versus the distributions, and you kind of look at, if it makes sense to you. And this is where I think the MicroStrategy options there may be an better alternative because they do have some capital structures and they've documented and they publish it quite regularly, actually daily, on how they're being managed. So yeah, look into those, I think, as an alternative to these MSTY and IMST. These are very kind of short-term opportunistic. And then the other question I had is on IBKR allowing you to buy it. I'm pretty sure they do. So
Yeah,
I may want
and
to
it
double
depends
check
on what
that
you're
again.
referring to buying there. If it's
Yeah.
buying Bitcoin itself, well, no, you're not buying it off of IBKR. You have to go to a Bitcoin exchange to buy Bitcoin and to hold it. Or if you want to buy the ETFs or MicroStrategy or right options, that is totally doable in IBKR
Absolutely.
Canada.
Yeah, and actually, Anthony touches on a very important point here. The reason why, like, MicroStrategy is also doing well. Keep in mind, like, MicroStrategy is fine. There's retail investors for MicroStrategy, but everything else that MicroStrategy does, their convertible bonds, a lot of that is really targeted to the bond market. The bond market, which I showed earlier, the $300 trillion market, they want access to Bitcoin because they see the returns there, but they can't hold Bitcoin because they're not allowed to hold Bitcoin. So MicroStrategy and the convertible debt and these kinds of solutions are really conduits for bond pension funds, large institutions to gain exposure to Bitcoin without necessarily owning it. So, to your question here, yeah, you cannot buy obviously Bitcoin on IBKR. That is not a vehicle, but you can certainly have access to the proxies or ETFs.
So I'm just now Anthony's leaning
We
in.
covered a lot of ground here, Cam.
Anthony's saying you
Wow.
can buy Bitcoin in the US on IBKR, but not Canada yet. And I am
Yeah, it's
in
possible.
disbelief on that, but
I don't know.
I don't
I
think
don't I
so.
don't
I
think you
think
can
you're
buy
being,
Bitcoin.
no, I'm pretty damn sure you can't.
It's not I mean, unless they've set something up, because like, for example, Coinbase, right, is or Kraken or Gemini, these are regulated exchange, or here in Canada, Newton or ShakePay, those are or Bull Bitcoin. These are regulated exchanges that allow you to buy and sell. They're basically money makers, right, for Bitcoin. So yeah, they are a regulated exchange. Globally, it's Binance and many others, crypto.com. So there are many regulated exchanges that allow
Right.
you to buy and sell Bitcoin. I don't, unless IBKR has applied for a
So
license and wants to be one,
yeah,
none that I've heard of. I haven't heard that, but yeah, I'll check it out.
I don't think they know what they're talking about when they say you can buy Bitcoin. When you call up IBKR and get their support, they probably don't know what they're talking about. They probably just think, buying a stock product of Bitcoin is what they're referring to because that's what they don't know. They don't probably understand the difference.
But if it is true and IBKR is going after opening up that market, again, that for me is
I
is
don't think it's true.
validation. Their banks are going after trying to look, custodying Bitcoin. So, if
Sure.
there is definitely, that's validation that there's definite interest in this
Yeah.
asset class.
I think it's fake news.
Good. Yeah, likely.
Yeah, it's because
How
it's
to
not.
wrap this up, Cam? Because we covered a lot of ground, man. Is there anything else we should? Omar, you've been what's top of mind on digital
No,
assets for
nothing
you?
more for me. In fact, actually, guys, I have a hard stop at 12. So,
Okay, and I think we're done here. So, anything else you want to cover? Any other
Harminder's got a
questions?
nice quote to leave off with.
Oh,
Strange
okay.
irony, but fiat currency may turn out to have been the Ponzi all along. Hear, hear.
yeah.
Well said, Harminder.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you all. Every so often, Wasim and the crew here gets together to talk Bitcoin, and we'll do another one in the near future. I hope you guys enjoy it, and let us know if there's any questions that you have. Always reach out. Always happy to talk about Bitcoin. I'm sure that that goes with all of them, all of the folks here. So at
Absolutely.
that, any last parting words, guys?
No.
No, thank you
Thanks
guys.
Keep
Much
hodling.
appreciated.
Keep hodling.
And do
Keep
your
DCAing.
research and make the investments that you think are going to benefit you the most. And maybe this is
Absolutely.
one of them.
All right.
Thanks
Thanks
for
so much,
seeing
guys.
Cam.
Have a good day.
Appreciate it.
Bye,
Have a
guys.
good weekend.
Bye,
You're
guys.
welcome.